Alright everybody, this is your final flip the classroom assignment for World War I. Today we're going to be talking about what post-war issues were facing Americans and how they deal with them. We've already talked about the peace treaty, which remember was the Treaty of Versailles, and we talked about how a lot of Americans were opposed to the peace treaty. Guys like Henry Cabot Lodge that want us to be more of an isolationist country, and I want you to keep remembering that cartoon of Uncle Sam with his hands tied behind his back. And the ribbons tying his hand behind his back were the League of Nations. So a lot of Americans saw the League of Nations as something that would do that to our country. That's why we never officially joined. Alright, so we are going to focus on two post-war trends in the United States, nativism and isolationism. Nativism is something that we've discussed since the 1840s. This is actually a flag from the 1840s that was for the Know Nothing Party. It's just a prejudice against foreign-born people. And remember, the Know Nothing or American Party was a secretive organization, but they were very opposed to immigration. Second big trend is going to be isolationism, and this is America trying to take itself out of world affairs. This is going to be tough since the world has become more globally connected. But if you see this cartoon, which you can tell is not World War I, this is World War II era, and we've got the woodpecker there with the Nazi swastika on him. This shows a kind of Dr. Seuss making fun of Americans that thought isolationism was something that could keep us separate from the world. A lot of people saw Europe as 3,000 miles away. Let's not get in their business. And right here you got Dr. Seuss, I don't know why I said Uncle Sam, kind of making fun of American ignorance there. Alright, another big thing that's going to kind of dominate the United States, not just after World War I, but really up until the 1990s, and even somewhat today, is a fear of communism. Communism is something you should have learned about in civics, but it's an economic and political system that's based on a single party ruled by a dictatorship. Today, the bigger communist countries that we hear more about are like North Korea, who we've heard a lot about in the news lately, China, Cuba, and our poor relations with Cuba go back to Fidel Castro's communist revolution. But remember, we said that during World War I, Vladimir Lenin led a Bolshevik revolution to make Russia a communist country, and that's part of why Russia withdrew from the war early, made that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. But this started a panic in the United States that what they called Reds, was a name for communists, will abolish capitalism everywhere. And I guess you could say that maybe there was a little bit of reason for this fear, because this guy Lenin thought that World War I was a moot point. He could make that peace treaty with Germany because pretty soon there was going to be a worldwide revolution, and there was going to be class warfare, and it was going to bring the end of all political wars between countries. And this is a cartoon from the 1960s that shows how Americans were still worried about communism. And you see Uncle Sam's on that boat about to hit an iceberg like the Titanic. This cartoon is just trying to imply that Americans need to watch out because communism is going to creep up on them. Well, in order to fight this communist influence that people thought was starting to spread throughout the United States, the U.S. Attorney General, a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, and J. Edgar Hoover, very interesting character who was the head of the FBI, they started hunting down anybody that was seen as radical. They started hunting down communists, socialists, anarchists. And the Palmer raids would sometimes trample people's civil liberties, and they would deport people without a trial, but they were trying to root out anybody that had a radical view of government, and they would consider communists as a radical. This is A. Mitchell Palmer right here, and this right here shows you what might happen to your business or maybe a newspaper office if they were seen as communist leaning. The main groups that were targeted by this were groups like this. I've got the Industrial Workers of the World. They were a labor union, nicknamed the Wobblies, but they were the people who would have to worry about the Palmer raids, because industrial labor unions were seen as communist and socialist type organizations by a lot of people. Alright, this anti-immigrant and anti-radical feeling was played out through the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. Alright, these are two Italian immigrants. Now they were anarchists. Anarchists believe that the government needs to be done away with. They were charged with murder in Massachusetts in 1920. As for whether or not they actually did it, there was evidence to both sides, and this is a artist's depiction of Sacco and Vanzetti. A lot of folks felt like they didn't do it. And this, you've got the painting called The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti, and you've got Sacco and Vanzetti in their caskets after they've been executed for this murder. And you've got in the background this window Judge Webster Thayer, who was a kind of chauvinistic judge that did not really give them and their lawyers a fair chance to present their case. But this case was almost open and shut before it even started in his eyes. But there were some pieces of evidence that showed that they were very bent on fomenting rebellion, and I can't remember which one of them, but one of them's homes was found a book on how to make bombs. But it was a murder of a night watchman at a company, murder and robbery that they were arrested for, and really the main reason that they were railroaded so quickly was because they were immigrants and because they were radicals. But if you see from this flyer, this is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so all across the country, people were trying to speak up for Sacco and Vanzetti. Now, there were a lot of Americans that were nativists, but there were also people that were saying this isn't fair. And both of these guys did have alibis, but they were sentenced to death. Many people throughout the rest of the world protested. In this kind of pixelated image, you can see a protest where people are holding signs saying, "We want justice for Sacco and Vanzetti. Defend, vindicate, liberate Sacco and Vanzetti." But I want you to recognize these two names and these two guys as being examples of the anti-immigrant and anti-radical hysteria that swept the United States following World War I. All right, and this anti-immigrant hysteria showed itself in some laws that Congress would pass, but another reason people were anti-immigrant was because after World War I, there wasn't as much need for unskilled labor in the United States. And a lot of people didn't want immigrants taking jobs that could be given to Americans because, remember, this is before minimum wage, and oftentimes immigrants were willing to work for much less pay than Americans were, or Native Americans. And this anti-immigrant feeling also leads to a rise in Ku Klux Klan membership. I've got there that the KKK membership reached 4.5 million by 1924. And we usually think of the Klan as being very opposed to the civil rights movement and anti-African American, but if you look at this list, anti-immigrant, anti-communist, anti-Semitic, means they're anti-Jewish, anti-African American, and anti-Catholic. Interesting there that they're anti-Catholic, but a lot of Americans felt like if we had many Catholic leaders, then America would basically become controlled by the Pope. We've only had one Catholic president, that was John F. Kennedy, and in part, I think that's why we've had one Catholic president, because Americans were, particularly Southerners, very anti-Catholic. This shows a Klan rally, and if you notice in the background, you've got the burning cross, which Klansmen actually thought they were the best Christians, which is very ironic because most of us today who know much about the Christian faith wouldn't consider themselves acting in a very Christian manner. And right there you see the American flag. They also consider themselves very patriotic Americans. And we talked about one thing that gave rise to Klan membership was a 1915 film by D.W. Griffith, who's the same director that shot that movie that we watched of Lincoln's assassination, where it was very, very corny acting. But it was called Birth of a Nation, and this is a little placard from the movie, and you can see that this was a quote from Woodrow Wilson, actually implying that the Ku Klux Klan was trying to protect the South. And remember, I said that Wilson was a progressive president, but he missed the ball on several things, including civil rights. This is a scene from the movie. It starts with the end of the Civil War and the Confederate kind of lost cause, and it makes it look like the Klan is trying to protect the South and the Southern white women from the evil Yankees and then former slaves. And right here you see an actor in blackface. And again, this was supposed to arouse passions in white Southerners particularly, and make them think that they needed to join the Klan to protect their country. Well, I mentioned a minute ago that Congress was going to start limiting immigration. The number of immigrants had jumped up to 600%, had jumped 600% from 1919 to 1921. That's just in 2 years. So Congress decided to start limiting how many people could come in from every other country. So the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 set a max number of people who could enter the U.S. from each foreign country each year. And once that limit was reached, no more immigrants from that country would be allowed in. And I've got here that was amended in 1924, and it really discriminated specifically against Eastern and Southern Europeans and Japanese. And if you remember back to our Goal 5 notes, these were a lot of people that would be considered the old immigrants. New immigrants. We talked about old and new immigrants. And this did not apply to the Western Hemisphere, which is kind of ironic since, most of the immigration news we hear about today is people from, is Latin American immigrants come to the United States. And we talk about laws, states like Arizona passing laws trying to amend immigrant status. Well, back then, in the 1920s, Western Hemisphere immigrants, such as Latin Americans, weren't seen as an issue. It was more the Southern Eastern Europeans and Asian immigrants. Well, after World War I, all that period of kind of let's set our troubles aside between labor and management that existed during World War I to try to promote the war effort went away. There was actually a police strike in Boston, which was a pretty big city, and obviously if the police go on strike, things could get ugly pretty quickly. So the Massachusetts governor, Calvin Coolidge, called out the National Guard, and this solved the crisis. Coolidge actually gained a little bit in popularity, and this is going to kind of springboard Coolidge on the platform to becoming president a few years down the road. There was also a strike among the coal miners. This guy that you see right there, John Lewis, led them to actually get a wage increase despite the fact that Woodrow Wilson tried to step in and arbitrate on the strike, and this led Lewis to become a national hero, and particularly for the working men. But eventually the labor movement does lose some appeal. As I mentioned, there was no minimum wage, and a lot of companies would pay immigrants much less than they would pay Americans. And a lot of immigrants spoke a lot of different languages, so it was very hard for these immigrants to organize into labor unions. Also, a lot of farmers that had moved to the city were kind of used to relying on themselves, so they didn't feel like they should have to depend on a labor union for a better way of life. And another problem was that most labor unions excluded African Americans, and we talked about how a lot of African Americans have now moved to northern cities to get jobs in wartime industries. Well, the exclusion of African Americans hurt a big potential voice for a lot of labor unions. All right, when we were discussing earlier the home front in World War I, we talked about the Espionage and Sedition Act. The Espionage and Sedition Act made it harder to speak out against the government or the war effort, and I told you there was a guy named Charles Schenck who was arrested for passing out pamphlets that told people that they should ignore the draft law, because the Selective Service Act, because the draft created a condition of involuntary servitude and violated the 13th Amendment. Well, the Supreme Court upheld the United States in this and said that it was okay to limit free speech if it's based on a clear and present danger to the United States. And Schenck wasn't being violent. He was encouraging peaceful action and protest, but he did end up being prosecuted for this. All right. After World War I, we also started to try to eliminate some of the causes of the war. Remember, I told you there were four major long-term causes of the war: nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and the alliance system. And part of our effort to address that militarism issue was the Washington Naval Conference, where we invited some of the major players in international naval power to the United States. And remember, Great Britain was very important because they had a two-power theory that they needed to have as many warships as the next two largest naval powers combined. So we were just discussing limiting the number of warships. And right there you see a U.S. destroyer in the picture named the James Williams. That actually was the first ship that my roommate from college served on when he was commissioned as an ensign, an officer in the Navy. Again, that's the USS James Williams. All right, and then we've talked about the weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles, and one big problem was that Germany was forced with a lot of heavy burden, and they had to pay $33 billion in war reparations that they couldn't afford to pay back to France and England. And then the U.S. had lent France and England money, so we created the Dawes Plan, named after an American banker, where we would loan money to Germany, who would then loan money to, or pay back their money to France and England, who could pay back money to the United States. So it was basically like we were taking money out of our left pocket, putting it in our right pocket. So it was not a good long-term solution, but it did, for the very brief period, 1920s, prevent an immediate world war from starting right after the first one. All right, now you've finished this assignment. Remember, go on the wiki and complete the Google form for tonight's assignment.